Emma Mayer, President of the IBP, to just quickly set up what the IBP is and why we're laying on this event and introduce everyone. So, Emma.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much indeed for coming to this, which is our first Futures Group session for 2019. I'm Emma Mayer. I'm the current IBP President, and during the daytime I'm the Director at Ocean Media Group, overseeing our housing publications. So it's a great pleasure to be here with everyone this evening. I'm just going to say a couple of thank yous and a big welcome before we get started and get stuck into to our session. Firstly, thank you very much indeed to Nick and to Redwood for supporting and hosting this event with the lovely theatre and so on. We really appreciate that. And thanks also to Barbara and colleagues at City University also for their support. It's great to see both members and students and colleagues and friends here with us. I thought I would just say a few words about the IBP for those of you who perhaps aren't members and aren't familiar. It's lovely to join. The IBP was set up in 1969 as a membership organisation to bring together journalists and comms professionals working in the built environment. During that time, we've hosted a range of different events, and we have a busy calendar each year designed to fulfil that purpose and also to celebrate the great work that goes on in the built environment community. So that includes our annual Journalism Awards and our annual Comms Awards as well. For those of you who are good at maths, you will have noticed that it's our 50th anniversary this year. So our snazzy Build on 50 logo, you saw it here first. Over the course of this year, we're going to be doing some additional special events to really celebrate our anniversary year. It's not so much about looking back, actually. Really, it's about looking forward at what we're going to be doing in the next 50 years. For those of us who are going to be around for part of that time, at least. So please do take a look out for the events that we've got coming up as part of our celebratory year. So it's now my great pleasure to move on and introduce our speakers for this evening. So I'm really delighted that we've got with us here Madison Marriage from Financial Times, who of course went up undercover at the President's Club and lifted the lid on that extraordinary story, which had and continues to have repercussions throughout the built environment and everywhere else, of course, as well. We also have with us here this evening Jane Bradley from Buzzfeed, Pulitzer Prize finalist, whose From Russia with Blood investigation series explored deaths on British soil. Just realised I've missed one slide again. Okay. And finally, Nick Duxbury, so going circular back to the beginning where we started. Nick is chair of the IBP Futures Group, so he put together this session and he's put together previous sessions. He always puts together a really great session, and this will be no exception. So I'm delighted to hand over to Nick and the panel. Thanks very much.
So first of all, thanks everyone for coming out tonight. I know it's Game of Thrones night, so this was probably quite a big sacrifice, so thank you. But most of all, thank you to our speakers, who I know are incredibly busy and up to their eyes in very, very serious investigative work right now. The theme of this event was supposed to be around investigative impact, and the thinking there was that investigations rely on a serious amount of resource. They take a lot of time, they take a lot of planning, and when you press the button, you're not always necessarily going to see a return on your money if you're a publisher. So it's hard if you're a journalist and you're having to sell these things in. You've got to try and guarantee that you're going to make as big an impact as possible, either for the brand or in terms of news value, or in terms of something that the publisher can take away and say, yes, that was worth it. Whether it's awards, and obviously both our speakers tonight have no shortage of awards. In fact, I think Madison, you just won one last week again. Yeah, another one. I'm not gonna beat around the bush. We're gonna get straight into this because I know Madison has to get away at 8. So we'll start with you, Madison. On the theme of, but before we kind of get into how you go about sort of, pitching in your investigation at the start, and kind of getting into that kind of nitty gritty with your editors about how you're going to actually deliver something worthwhile, especially on such a contentious issue as you did with the President's Club dinner. It would be great to just get a really quick overview of sort of how you got to where you are at the FT, and whether you've done sort of much in the way of investigative work before that, because your speciality is accounting and tax. So it'd be great to kind of, because there's a lot of business journalists in the room tonight, so it'd be great to get just a quick overview of kind of how you got to where you are before President's Club turned up.
So I'm assuming, do you want how I got into journalism full stop? Or
more just how you got to the FT and ended up focusing on finance.
So my first job in journalism was with a trade publication run by Incisive Media. So I think they've got about 100 magazines, and I worked for 2 magazines there. And if I'm honest, I didn't love journalism when I was there, and I was on the brink of looking at jobs in consulting and packing it all in and not doing journalism anymore. And I actually applied for a job at the FT for a trade pub within the FT, because at the time I was living about 5 minutes from this office, and I realised my commute would be a 5-minute walk to work. And the publication I was applying for wasn't actually the FT newspaper. It was behind a paywall, and you couldn't read any of its content, so I knew nothing about what it wrote, other than the fact it wrote about fund management, which is what I've been writing about, and would be a 5-minute walk to work. So I applied, I think, on the day of the deadline and had a job interview, and I went into that interview because I knew nothing about them. I think I was a bit bolshier than I normally would have been, and was really asking them about their advertising model and how many readers they had and whether they're any good. And I think maybe I was almost too confident. But anyway, they offered me the job, and I spent about a year working for that kind of FT group publication. And then within a year, I was promoted onto the newspaper. And that was initially as an asset management reporter. And then I got promoted within that team a couple of times. And then 18 months ago, I became tax and accounting correspondent. So definitely not an expert on tax and accounting. But the beauty of being at the FT, and that's why I love the FT, is that they really give you the freedom to do things which are completely unrelated to your job. So I've written articles for the magazine, I've written things, I wrote a magazine piece about an anarchist dog walker, I've done pieces about Jeremy Corbyn and the wealthy and why they're scared of him. I've done things which have got no relation to my day job. And I actually do try and do that as often as I can, because I can get sick to death of tax and accounting sometimes. And obviously that gives you the freedom to do investigations as and when they crop up.
So how did President's Club dinner crop up? Where did that come from?
It was a tip. I should have brought the slide actually. I've got a screenshot of the text, which I keep on my, I didn't bring it, so sorry. I've got a screenshot of the text that came in from a friend saying, I think I've got a story for you, kind of ... And this is a friend of mine who had done some hostessing work in the past. So essentially, you're front of house at events, so at Twickenham or at the tennis or at big music concerts, you essentially show executive people to their chairs and fetch them drinks. It's normally not meant to be controversial or particularly sordid. And she had heard on the grapevine repeatedly from other women to avoid a particular event called the President's Club. And that year she was thinking of doing it because she was quite short of cash. And she'd done a bit more research and heard some real horror stories. So and she didn't know much about it, so she flagged it to me saying, I've heard this event is really horrible and that women are treated really badly, you might want to take a look. And that got me digging.
So presumably did any of your colleagues, previously kind of the property beat, were they aware of President's Club dinner? Was it a sort of mythical thing? Had any of them been?
I actually didn't, well, when I first heard of it, I didn't know that it had a property, a lot of the people there were from the property industry. So initially I thought it was kind of hedge funds and bankers. And it was actually only after having gone there and getting a copy of the guest list that we realised how heavily represented it was by property people. So yeah, we didn't know who would be there in advance. I mean, that's why we had to go in and to find out. And did my colleagues know about it? I mean, you don't want to run around the newsroom saying, has anyone heard about this thing? Because once half the newsroom knows about it, they tell, their wives or their, newsrooms can be gossipy places. You need to keep this stuff under wraps. So there was initially maybe 5 people internally who were told, but none of them had heard of it. And these were some people who've been writing about the city for 20 odd years. But since the article came out, there have been journalists at other newspapers, quite senior journalists who said, oh, I was invited to that and went along to it 10 years ago, and maybe it's taken a turn for the worse.
I saw that Harry Wallop one.
Yeah, exactly. we heard that from a number of people who attended over the past decade or two. But I equally interviewed women who worked at it over the last decade or two, and I heard the same horror stories from every single one of them.
So from the moment where you first got that text message and kind of what's this? What was the kind of lead up from there to kind of getting editors buy-in, and kind of at what point did you feel like you were onto something and able to actually pitch it in?
All the way along, I kept thinking the whole thing would fall through, because I thought I wasn't sure that we would succeed. I thought the undercover operation would collapse. I thought they'd figure out who I was. I wasn't confident that we'd get it done at all until pretty much I was walking out of the Dorchester at 3 a.m. And scarpering back to our kind of hotel headquarters to offload everything to my editor. So you do have to find the right editor. So I found, I spoke to the financial services editor. He said, sounds good. Maybe you should speak to the investigations editor. And he was actually working abroad at the time. So I think he was in Mozambique or something. So I called him on a very crackly line and started outlining what by that point I knew about I'd done my research. So I knew more about the organization, who tended to show up, and had spoken to some women. So I had a better idea of what went on. And within 2 or 3 sentences, he was like, yeah, this sounds like a great story, we've got to go for it. So with his backing, it was then easier to kind of get the necessary permission. But there was a very lengthy, drawn out legal discussions within the FT that I wasn't involved in at all, where I think senior editors were discussing, the ethics of going undercover and the public interest element of the story and my personal safety. And they had all these considerations that they didn't want to hear my opinion on. They wanted to decide for themselves. And then eventually I said, this is crazy, you need to hear from me as well. And had a meeting with the editor where he basically said, why should we do this? And I gave him my elevator pitch, and he gave me permission, so that was it.
Superb. So what was the time frame there?
So the tip came in November, and we had quite a tight time frame because we knew that they were hiring women to work at the event up until kind of late December. So we had to get my application in by mid-December, and we actually I sent off my application the day I got permission. So the clock was winding down. It was already mid to late December by that point, and I knew that they needed 130 hostesses and that 80 had been hired or something. And then the event itself was in mid-January.
So did you have a plan B if you didn't get through the application process? Were you going to kind of put it on ice till next year, or were you going to try and...
It's a good question. No, we didn't have a well thought out plan B. I think the logical thing to have done would have been traditional journalism, i.e. trying to speak to as many women as possible and doing it without going undercover. Our concern with doing it that way is that increasingly people just say, nah, fake news, all made up, da da da. So sometimes relying on that kind of testimony can be problematic.
Because I mean, as an outsider looking in, it struck me as like quite an un-FT execution in, the way that you don't often see stings from the FT or kind of undercover things. Yeah, is that the first one?
Yeah, as far as I'm aware, I've been told it was our first undercover thing.
Quite a leap of faith for your editors as well.
It was, and it was my idea, so it couldn't have worked. An editor couldn't have approached me and said, you know what, we think you should go and do this, because that would have been really problematic as well as to why they. And I know of reporters at other media groups who are approached in that way to do things, and it actually makes them really unhappy. Newspapers aren't always ethical places. So yeah, it had to come from me, and it did. And it was unusual.
So how many women do you feel like you sort of approached before you were able to get to the stage of kind of going, right, I'm confident that this is going to deliver, given what a big kind of dice roll this is for my editors?
I don't really want to go into precise logistics, but enough to know that we spoke to women who'd worked there when the previous year, 2 years before, 3 years before, 5 years before, 10 years before. We had enough, yeah.
And so, when you were kind of preparing to kind of actually go undercover and do it, what was sort of going through your mind? Were you in the lead up to the event, were you thinking, as the, maybe you're looking for specific staff, or did you kind of go in there with a fairly clear expectation of what you were looking for, or was it just a kind of...
So we had a chat, obviously we had big meetings internally before the event took place, and the number one rule is you're there as an observer. So you're not trying to catch people out, you're not trying to flirt with people, you're not trying to, you're just there to watch. So that's the goal I went in with.
So, I mean, from an observer point of view, were you kind of nervous or concerned?
Yeah, terrified. It was terrifying on tons of levels. Heart properly thudding as I approached the hotel that afternoon, and it was very, very scary. Probably, so I had to arrive at the Dorchester at 3 or 4 p.m. and then I'd say the first half hour, your heart's in your throat and your heart's thudding, and it was really nerve-wracking. And then as the evening progressed, you just got, not relaxed, but you knew you'd gotten past the first hurdle of they're not going to catch me out right now.
Because one of the things that I thought was really interesting about this was that the video that you created, that you sort of filed as part of the story, kind of it delivered like quite an emotional punch, because you could see that you were pretty shattered and you were pretty disgusted, and in a funny way that kind of just gave it like an extra dimension. I don't know whether other FTS investigations, I know obviously you haven't done stings before, but how crucial that kind of, because you really were kind of at the centre of the story, which is the thing that a lot of journalists are quite nervous about becoming. So I mean, was that kind of difficult for you, or were you actually very willing to put yourself in that kind of narrative?
I was personally surprised and potentially a bit naive about to what extent I did become part of the story, but I guess in hindsight it was inevitable. But I didn't expect my face to be attached to how other newspapers covered it, or for people to want interviews with me, or I don't know if that makes sense. I completely underestimated that, and I completely underestimated everything. I had no idea that the response would be the response it was, and that it would travel to kind of every corner of the globe, and the response was massive, and obviously, mostly positive, but with a massive response always comes a negative response, and that side of it I was also completely underprepared for. So I think there were lots of things I hadn't thought about, which I would now think about a lot more carefully.
Yeah, so I mean the impact of that piece was extraordinary, like huge, and I think everyone knows, a scoop is the story that everyone literally has to follow up because they don't have a choice, and that was very much this. You can't actually put a couple of screenshots there of kind of all the different angles and takes that everyone else quickly followed up with, but I think it would be great to get a sense of what the impact was at the FT, because my understanding was it kind of broke some records for click-through and things like that. Is that right?
Yeah, it's our most read online story by some margin, and that, which is a really good thing.
But I mean, what did impact sort of, what did impact mean to you when you went in there? Did you have any hopes for what you wanted the story to do?
Yeah, I think for me, impact isn't how many people read a story, it's the changes it potentially leads to. And I think the most important, best possible change it could lead to is that privileged men or women who are thinking about abusing other people in a less powerful position will think twice about that next time. So whether it's a waitress or a hostess or a flight attendant or any, wherever you get a kind of power imbalance in the workplace, potential gropers, I hope, will think twice about it. So that would be, this kind of behaviour was just considered acceptable because of that power imbalance, and because they assumed the women would never talk about it because they'd all been forced to sign quite strict and I think illegally enforced non-disclosure agreements before they began work that night. And I think scrutiny of non-disclosure agreements has increased as a result. And impact is one, I think, pointing out unacceptable behaviours and hoping that it limits them in future, and two, hoping that actual change comes about. And there was some immediate changes. So, people lost roles in governments and on the boards of charities, and there were 3, I think, official investigations set up as a result. So there were immediate consequences, which is great. But I think the good thing is the kind of cultural impact, which I think it had. But God knows how long that will last.
I think that's fair to say it has. I mean, do you think that it's made a kind of impact at the FT in terms of how they sort of approach these sort of stories now? Is there a kind of because one question former colleagues and I were discussing when your story first broke, as someone who used to write about the property industry, was whilst we weren't aware of the President's Club dinner, there were like big global events like MIPIM, where there were, the whole hiding in plain sight thing was fairly clear, and it simply, never crossed our minds as a story. There was a whole industry of trade journalists who were broadly complicit in that. Yeah. So I guess I know from personal experience that it's made a lot of people think twice about the way that they approach their individual trades. And then their audiences. But I mean, what about at the FT? Because there is a sort of obviously you had a very, very powerful group of people at the President's Club dinner, but the FT also has a very broad readership of kind of business people that is male-dominated world. How's it changed approaches there?
If you mean have we been blacklisted by a load of senior businessmen who are in attendance at the President's Club? Not that I'm aware. But the beauty of that was tax and accounting is not specific to any sector, so I'm not reliant on property executives for tips. And actually my colleague who does cover property was on maternity leave at the time, so she could firmly distance herself from the story, and hopefully nobody's going to blame her for that one. I think probably a few people were and remain pissed off about it, but I don't think that should deter you from chasing difficult stories that might upset a few people who are not behaving very well.
Do you think it's increased the FT's appetite to do more of this type of story?
I think probably there's always been a lot of appetite in the FT to do, fantastic big investigations that have impact. I am told, but I'm not trying to big myself up, but that this has changed how outsiders view the FT. So I think people now are coming to us with stories when they might not have done in the past. And people, I know of certain people who've said that they subscribe to the FT because of this story. So I hope that, if anything, it's increased the pool of potential stories we can do. And I've got colleagues who've done some amazing stuff since then as well. So people who are interested in financial journalism, I recommend you go and read my colleague Dan's Wirecard stories. They're really good.
Fantastic. Okay, and I mean, you did just sort of briefly say that you underestimated the impact it would have on you personally. I mean, is it possible to kind of talk about that a little bit? Because I think when people take on a story, obviously they hope it'll be as big as it could possibly be. But and both of you, have taken on some pretty big stories. But I mean, if you were turning back time and you were having a sort of taking it on again, is there anything that you would do differently, or anything like sort of psychologically for yourself you might have thought about or kind of prepared yourself for?
I think I would have been more scared of doing the story had I known what the reaction and the reach of it would have been. So in a way, I'm glad that I didn't know that and that I underestimated it, because I did go in there potentially, foolishly, less scared than I should have been. I would have been a lot more nervous and probably wouldn't have been able to keep my cool had I known. And then in terms of what I would have done differently, I don't think, the investigation went as well as it possibly could have done, so I don't think I would have done anything differently in the run-up to it, but I would have prepared myself more for the social media backlash and that aspect of it, which I just never encountered before. I've never been trolled before. I've never had people sending me, really disgusting messages. And that was, I reacted really, not childishly to it, but, I was emotional, really emotional. And I think had I had some more time to prepare for that side of it, I could have, again, kept my cool a bit better and been less emotional. But there's nothing to be ashamed of in being emotional. But I did cry a lot in front of many colleagues, and I wish I could erase those moments. But there we go.
Oh, at least it wasn't the Christmas party. You got reasons.
Yeah.
That's brilliant. Well, look, thanks very much for that. We'll let everyone open up and ask you questions, because I'm sure lots of people have got a lot of questions about that. But just before we do, I thought kind of go the same way with you, Jane. So obviously you're you've always been investigations focused, is that right?
Mostly. I mean, I started off traditionally in a news role, so I was doing daily breaking news, but I'd basically wanted to do investigations since I was about 16. I was one of those annoying kids who knew what they wanted to do very young. So when I got my first break, it was on the BBC's journalism trainee scheme. I was just a kind of trainee news journalist, and for the next 3 years I worked in regional newsrooms, which are very under-resourced, and what it meant as a young journalist, which was so great, is I got thrown in the deep end. They couldn't be like, no, we need someone else to do this, no, you're not experienced enough. It was just, we need all hands on deck. So what that meant was I could pitch my own stories and could work my own stories. So obviously as a young 21-year-old journalist, I wasn't being given the best stories. They weren't exactly ones that are on my CV now. So what I wanted to do was pitch the type of stories that I wanted to have on my CV, so investigations, kind of more hard-hitting stuff, and I had great editors who let me do that. So from kind of that general news background, I then worked my way up to become an investigations producer at BBC London TV, where I was only doing off-rota stuff instead of the daily stuff. And from there kind of worked my way up to Panorama eventually, and doing kind of traditional investigative stuff before leaving Panorama and going to work for the Cat GIF website, which everyone was very shocked at the time. And loved it, and have been there for the past 4 years, and slowly working my way through kind of trying to get rid of that cat GIF image, which is kind of dying now.
Yeah, I think you probably put that to bed. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of heads turned when BuzzFeed started hiring big names specifically around investigations, because it seemed like a bit of a statement of intent, and it seems like you really delivered on that, and the team. You've got a very, very high-powered team with you as well. Can you just give us a really quick overview of your kind of highlights reel for the last kind of 2 years or so? Because there's been quite a diverse sort of mixture of heavy hitting investigations.
Yeah, I mean, so my team, we're a team of 6 on the investigations team at Buzzfeed, and we were set up by our bosses in the US, specifically initially to investigate financial corruption and financial crime, because of this perception that London is at the centre of that. So when I joined Buzzfeed, we were doing a lot of work on money laundering and tax avoidance. One of our first big investigations was one into the Conservative Party's biggest corporate donor, a telecoms firm called Leica Mobile, and we basically went undercover for 6 weeks, found evidence of the money laundering. It launched kind of this big international investigation and has led to charges in France. And we also did a lot on extremism and terrorism at the start. One of the ones that we worked on that was a big success was unmasking 2 of the Beatles, ISIS executioner cell. So I tracked down Alexander Coty and El Mafi El Sheikh and identified them before the rest of the media picked up on that. And then obviously the one I think we're most well known for is our investigation into the suspected Russian assassinations on British soil. And that was a journey. that was a journey. I'm sure you'll come to that in a minute, so I won't talk too much right now.
Yeah, we definitely want to go on that journey. Just before we do though, the shift to BuzzFeed, like when you first got there, and obviously the cat GIF thing was flying about, but when you got there and you sat down, and were you sort of like, what makes a BuzzFeed investigation? What's the criteria for it hitting the spot for BuzzFeed? Does it have to go viral, or what's the criteria?
I mean, our criteria for an investigation is pretty old-fashioned. It's something that exposes some kind of wrongdoing on a systemic scale, ideally global. It's something that's going to shock people. That's some kind of, corruption or wrongdoing or abuse of the vulnerable. So very traditional stuff. And there's never been any pressure that I felt at BuzzFeed about going viral. Like, we have the amazing Buzz team to do that, and that's kept very separate from the investigation. So the onus, the pressure is on them to get kind of these 1 million plus views. For us, it's just to deliver these really important public interest investigations that's going to lead to some kind of change and win awards was the big aim of our investigations. And I guess the one thing that's slightly different from when I did investigations at the BBC is that we've got a younger audience. Like, the majority of our audience are millennials, whereas at the BBC the average audience was kind of 65 plus. So when I say that, a lot of people will ask me, you know, does that change the type of investigations that you do? But actually, I don't think it does change the type of investigations we do, because young people get angry at what older people get angry at, injustice and wrongdoing. It doesn't change depending what age you are. The only thing that's different is how we tell these stories. So how we package them. We get 75% of our traffic through social media. Like, no one goes, oh, I'll log on to Buzzfeed in the morning and see what's in the news. People are like, oh, my friend's tweeting about this or sharing this on Facebook, so let me read this. So we really have to punch through a lot of noise and grab people's attention rather than publishing a story and expecting people to come to us for it. So I hope we've got quite good at really punching through that noise and grabbing people, whether it's with a video, whether it's a graphic, whether it's sometimes a game we'll do, and obviously in the writing as well. That's really important.
I mean, that's really interesting because I think most people in the room probably are used to kind of long form, long form pieces. If you're going to put a lot of time into an investigation, then you almost want to do it justice. You probably got the Pulitzer Prize committee in your back of your mind as you're drafting the intro, But actually, are you finding that there's not necessarily that kind of appetite for really long form, and that you need to break it up into kind of bite-sized pieces, or have interactivity, or kind of have more of a video emphasis on it? What are you sort of seeing, and is it changing the way that you go about doing these things?
I think, look, no one's going to read like a 10,000 boringly written, dry piece on council bins or something, right? So the first thing is obviously the topic that we're telling a story about. And as part of that, we think about obviously ways to freshen it up and make it engaging. That might be a video, it might be kind of a game in it or something like that. But we find that certainly our audience, who are generally young people, they really like long reads. We found that people either want something that's kind of short and snappy, like a 500-word news article, or they want something 1,000 words and over, like properly invest in the long read. What we found they hated or didn't follow was that kind of middle ground, that kind of 700-800 word type piece. So I think as long as you pick the right topic and you tell it in an engaging way, whether that's the writing or kind of the furniture around it, then people will stick with it.
That's really interesting. So I mean, in terms of what the team dynamic is, where do you get your leads? How do you break them up? Because you do quite a lot of collaborative working, which is not something necessarily every journalist is used to doing.
Especially not investigative journalists.
Yeah, you want to keep your cards close to your chest. How does that work?
You know what, like, we're a really tight team, and there's only like 6 of us on the investigations team in the UK. And when I've worked in other newsrooms, especially the larger they are, the more this is a problem. People kind of get a bit competitive or tight with their contacts. They go, no, that's my lead, that's my contact. But I think because we're such a small team, because we're a bit of an underdog and we have to be a bit scrappy and work together, then there's none of that competitiveness. So we all bring in tips and leads, we all share them. We generally, you very rarely do a one byline piece. So you'll usually work with at least one other colleague. And that's because the type of stories that we're punching for are these kind of huge systemic investigations. Like the Russia one was a transatlantic investigation with, I think we had bloody 8 bylines or something, but we honestly couldn't have done it without us all taking on a different part of that role, and we all have different strengths. So like my colleague Tom Warren is brilliant at documents and financials, so he tends to take the lead on that. Me and my colleague Richard Holmes, we tend to do kind of the doorsteps or the getting whistleblowers to speak to us type thing. And Heidi Blake, my editor, is obviously brilliant and brings in every big story that we've done. So yeah, it's that rare team dynamic, I think, that you often don't get in investigative journalism especially, which is seen as quite, I think, a lone wolf trade.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, how many sort of investigations do you generally work on at any one given time? Have you got quite a few going concurrently? What's the...
No, and people who work in news would be horrified about how few things we work on. So generally, if it's the early stages of an investigation, I'll tend to have like 2 or 3 on the go to see which one kind of, because investigations are risky, so half of the time they won't stand up, you won't get to the level of proof you need. So I personally like to have at least a few that I'm juggling for when inevitably one falls down or the lawyer says no, F off type thing. But then when you get to publication, so a story I'm working on right now, we have the luxury of only working on one at that point, because it is so kind of time consuming and intense that we don't really have the time to juggle more stories than that. So we're really, really lucky. There's never kind of any pressure, and I think this is very rare in the newsroom to be churning out stories. Even when I worked for investigations at Panorama, if you didn't have one out every few months, it'd be like, right, where's your next story? Whereas Buzzfeed, they're like, no, spend more time on this. No, don't take any more stuff on. So yeah, I'm incredibly lucky. I'd say it depends on the type of story, but like last year, I think I had 2 or 3 big investigations out. This year, I'm sorry, last year was 2. The year before that, there was only 1 because it was the big Russia investigation. And that, for me, coming from news, was quite tough because you really had to hold your nerve because you're investing all that time and resources on a really risky story. And if it doesn't come off, you've got nothing to show for a year's work.
That does sound a bit terrifying.
It is terrifying.
Just before we go to Russia, how many stories have you had that you've put months of work into that have been spiked or have been shut down by lawyers or haven't seen the light of day?
A lot less now. I'm not working for the BBC, to be honest. Generally, I've not had any spiked at Buzzfeed so far. I will spike them myself if, like the story I'm working on now, there are a few different types of stories I was looking at the time, and you quickly learn the signs as to whether you think there's a story there or whether what you've been told by a source doesn't stand up. So I kind of, my editor trusts me to kind of cull the ones that I don't think are going anywhere. But I think investigations are risky, and I've certainly had ones that have been culled before. Like I said, kind of at the BBC, there's a lot of scrutiny and they're under constant attack, sometimes rightly, sometimes wrongly. And there was a lot more caution kind of at the top, particularly I do undercovers at the BBC and things like that. So there, where it had to kind of clear editorial policy, legal, as well as kind of the inevitable attack if things go wrong, it was harder to get stories to that level and over the legal line, which I think the caution is often a good thing, and we need to be absolutely thorough, because if you'd have 10 years of brilliant investigations out and just one mess up can ruin your entire career. So I'm not having a go at the BBC. It's right to have those high benchmarks. I just think you also need investigative journalism. You need to have an appetite for risk to tell the big stories, balanced with the caution.
So appetite for risk, you took on Putin effectively. So can you talk to us a little bit about that? Because that took you 2 years, was it? 2 years?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think I've worked on anything for 2 years.
I haven't.
Yeah, where did that come from, and how did you manage to kind of keep on it for 2 years and not pull the trigger and make it happen?
It was the hardest story that I've ever done in my whole career, to be honest. The story initially came from a tip from my editor, Heidi Blake. She had basically got hold of this box of documents linking to the death of one man's property developer, Scott Young. And this was 2015, so well before before Russia became at the centre of politics and news. And it started off nothing to do with Russia at all. The story started off about how the police had failed to investigate this man's death. And there were so many kind of obvious clues, like CCTV hadn't been checked, no forensics had been done on where he died. So initially it seemed to be an investigation to how the police had failed to carry out a proper investigation. Then we started looking through the documents, and I think there were about 2 million of them. So we had to set up a special searchable electronic database called an OCR, so we could input all of them and then search them using key terms that we thought might turn up something interesting. And when we started doing that, we noticed a pattern that this guy, Scott Young, was linked to the circle of, I think it was about 5 other businessmen through this property development on the outskirts of Moscow, which was nicknamed Project Moscow. And we realized those men had all died as well. So at that point, my editor said, right, let's see if there are any other suspicious deaths linked to Russia on British soil. So we just did a very traditional clipping search and kind of pulled out all the suspicious deaths where somebody might have been linked to Russia in one way or the other, and then kind of worked our way down, looking at the evidence, saying, no, yes, we think there's something there, we think there's not. And then the big breakthrough really came. It was like paragraph 5 in a New York Times article, which mentioned that US Congress had this report, which had been compiled by intelligence officers on suspicious deaths, which might be linked to Russia on US soil. So we thought, wouldn't it be interesting to find out if they also have a report like this on UK soil, and if any of these names are on this list. So one of our brilliant reporters in the US, Jason Leopold, a national security reporter for years, he basically got in touch with some of his sources, and we tried to get hold of this ODNI report or list. And I never forget the day when we heard from him. We were all sat at our computers, we weren't doing that much, we were getting quite frustrated with the story, if I'm honest. And then on Signal, this messaging service that we all use, encrypted, we just got this message with him going, every single name is on the ODNI report. And we were just like, what, every single name, are you sure? And he spoke to my editor, and he's very well sourced, and then he managed to get a second, a third source to confirm it. They were all on this report. There were other names in the EU that weren't on the report, but all of the UK names that would narrow it down were on the report. So then we set about trying to get as many sources as possible and corroboration and things like that. But yeah, that was how it kind of really took off and became a big investigation focused on Russia in particular.
Wow. So, I mean, in terms of the kind of timeline of how you then turned it into what you turned it into, you know, how fast was that when you kind of had that kind of epiphany moment where you were kind of like, right, I think this is stacked up, we're ready to go. What happens then?
Well, like, it took a long time to get to that point. So we had that breakthrough moment about 3-4 months before we published. So we'd been investigating these deaths for 1.5 years, and we were kind of getting, you know, pieces of information that looked suspicious, but obviously not the conclusive or the real line that we needed to go with this. And then when we got that, things started moving very quickly, and we got the story kind of ready to go within like a month. But then the snap election happened. Then the Westminster attack happened. Basically, it was the busiest summer of news I'd say in history, but we've got this year. So we had to hold on it, and any journalist will tell you, sitting on a story that's ready to go is the most nerve-wracking thing, because you think you're about to get scooped or something's going to happen and a source is going to pull out. So we had to keep sitting on it, and in the end, as I think happens with most investigations, we had some of the biggest breakthroughs right at the end, where we had some big breakthroughs on the death of Alexander Perepelichny. We have got this source who has worked in French law enforcement, who basically were treating it as a suspected assassination and was saying the British authorities weren't doing anything about it. And yes, so even though we had to wait, we got some of the big breakthroughs at the end, which made it kind of feel worthwhile until we published it, and then it kind of went nowhere initially when we first published it. It was kind of a 2-year investigation that we hoped would go everywhere, and when we published it, and it kind of got a few like page 5 or something at the Times, it was pretty gutting, to be honest, because this was something we spent so much time working on. And I understand why, because it was all kind of anonymous intelligence sources and documents not a lot of reporters had or had the time to go through. So I understand why, but it kind of was a real question about the impact and the logic in spending that long on a story if you don't know if it's going to take off. But then 6 months later, Sergei Skripal, the attack happened. And at that point, kind of everyone was like, oh, did it Buzzfeed do something on this that we didn't really pay attention to at the time? And suddenly, like, our phones everyone wanted to speak to us, and the Home Office launched a review, which obviously was just a political statement. the Met Police former commissioners were calling for them to reopen the files. So we kind of had to wait 6 months, and I've never known going from like zero impact almost to suddenly like getting every kind of impact you want, like real action, the newspaper headlines, things like that. So it was one we really had to hold our nerve on, to be honest.
So, I mean, do you think it's got further to run? I mean, do you think you're going to be able to kind of, what would be the kind of ideal outcome for you at this point?
I honestly never want to report on Russia again. I don't think, I kind of feel like, to be honest, Russia's kind of old news now, and people are looking more towards the Saudi and China and things like that. We started looking into this story in 2015 before kind of it all took off. So I don't think there's that much more to do on that, and I'm not, you know, you get some journalists who, once they've done an amazing story on something, they just want to report on that. I'm the opposite. Once I've finished an investigation, I want nothing more to do with it, to be honest. I'm so fed up of living and breathing it that I just want to do something different. So basically, no.
Fair enough. But I mean, it strikes me that you must have undertaken quite a serious amount of risk, you know, along the process there. So I mean, you know, intelligence services, meeting people. You know, if that's your thing, you know, I will send in Jane. She'll have a coffee with I'm sure. You know, was that scary? What was that like?
I mean, I think it's important to point out that obviously any risk that we took on this story as British journalists is absolutely nothing compared to the risk that journalists in Russia, for example, are taking in publishing anything critical of the government. So it was scary because I'd never done any story like that before. My biggest fear till then was kind of lawyers that were going to sue me, not you know, Russian intelligence services. So it was scary, but I don't want to kind of blow it out of context. Having said that, I think
lawyers have died, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And having said that, I think, you know, a lot of the risk was on my editor, Heidi. So 3 weeks before we published, she basically had to go and live in a hotel for 3 weeks because there was a car that had turned up outside her house every single day for the last month. And weirdly, the weirdest thing that really freaked us out was when she went to Paris to interview kind of this big eyewitness who had last seen this Alexander Peripolichny guy alive, when she was speaking to that person over in Paris, the car had gone, but her neighbour had been keeping an eye on it. And the minute she kind of touched down in London, he said the car's back. And it had gone like during the whole time in Paris, and then it was kind of back. So it wasn't subtle surveillance. It was obviously designed to intimidate, and that is something that the intelligence services in Russia do a lot of. So we don't know who it was. We don't know whether it's the intelligence services. We don't know whether it was organised criminals, because often there is a crossover, particularly in Russia. But it was particularly scary for her. And yeah, 3 weeks until we published. But the idea was once we publish, then there's much less risk to us because the story's out there, and you know, it's only they want to stop the story getting out. So I think my editor took on the most risk because she was the one targeted and being followed and having to stay in a hotel for 3 weeks before we published.
Wow. I'm conscious a lot of people here probably have a lot of questions. So we're going to open it up to you guys to ask away. So Gerald here, if you raise your hand in the air, he'll come to you with a microphone. So, yes.
I want to ask, do you have any advice on like balancing investigations either alongside each other or alongside the more mundane humdrum stuff? Because it strikes me that it's a major challenge, just keeping the will going and the kind of admin going over weeks or months of it. It just gets lost in the more humdrum stuff. How do you kind of keep it on the back burner and bring it back when it needs to be brought back?
So I did 2 investigations last year, so the President's Club and WPP, and then I'm doing 1 at the moment, and I've had to do all 3 of them on top of my day job, so I am dealing with the humdrum on a daily basis. And I got, with President's Club, I had maybe 2 or 3 days off diary, which is not a lot, and with WPP, same again, and with this one, no time off diary so far. So yeah, what do? You do get a bit, you're probably the same, you can get totally obsessed by an investigation, especially if it's interesting. So you end up, sending emails and checking your LinkedIn and, updating spreadsheets in your own time. And you do have to be a bit obsessive about it. I can't ignore my desk. So when they're calling for news stories, you have to write your news story. So you have to do it around the edges. It is frustrating. Actually, I'm moving to the investigations team in June, so I will finally have the liberty of being able to spend a year on a story or 3 months on a story. Although my colleagues on the investigations desk do have to do a bit of juggling as well, so they are working on kind of multiple things in tandem. Yeah, I think when you've got a big one that's live, you do have to only focus on that if you can, but often you can't.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with what Madison said. Obviously, I don't have that problem right now, but when I started off, I was doing news stuff as well. And I think you have to kind of squeeze the time in. Like, I would do a lot of evening work or weekend work, which isn't ideal all the time. But even if it's just like an hour to meet a contact or an hour to do an FOI, like you can do stuff kind of while you've got, I think, a bit of downtime, even though it's difficult and it's really unfair because they want you to bring in big scoops, but also do your day job. But I just think that if there's a really good story you're excited about, then your editor would hopefully allow you to have some time, at least when it's coming up to publication, and otherwise you kind of make space around the outsides, really.
Yes.
Do you have any tips on when you kill the story? When do you give up?
That's a really good question. So I had this with the story I'm working on now. I had 3 different tips when I started off. When I started off looking into this, and I think part of it is you get kind of an instinct of knowing when a story has legs or not. So for example, the story that I'm working on now, it was very clear that there was a story there when I started speaking to the sources that other people had put me in touch with, and they were saying exactly the same thing as what I'd initially been told. It stood up, and they could also put me on to somebody else who could tell me something else about that, and there was a clear route from getting from A to B, whereas the other story that I ended up dropping, once I spoke to the original source, they were like, no, it wasn't like that at all, or they couldn't tell you anybody else who knew about it. So it felt like the route from getting the story out wasn't as clear. And I think you have to cut your losses, sadly, early on if you think there's not a story there, otherwise you can waste a year, 2 years on a story.
Yeah, I haven't I'm trying to think if I've had a story that a legal barrier came. I mean, the biggest risk for me is a legal barrier. So the thing I'm working on at the moment, I am slightly terrified that I'll have put in weeks, if not months of work, and then we'll get injuncted. And, we could be in a Telegraph type situation with Philip Green or worse. But if you believe in the story, you just got to admit to yourself that you might spend hours on something and it will be a complete waste of time, but the story is important enough to at least give it a shot. So that, I'm looking at that situation right now and slightly kind of dreading this dark cloud of legal risk that's ahead. But I really want to publish this, so fingers crossed.
Hello. I feel like good stories rely a lot on having great detail, but sometimes you're also speaking to anonymous sources whose details potentially out them to a limited audience, if not everyone. How do you balance keeping sources anonymous and continuing forward with a story where you have to sort of potentially blur out the detail, maybe to an extent where it confuses the issue or may worry about confusing the issue for readers? How do you strike that balance?
In every conversation with a source, you establish at the beginning whether it's off record, on background, and if it's something contentious or very sensitive, you tend to speak off record or on background. And even today I was doing calls where the person I was talking to said, I'm going to tell you this because I want you to have the detail, but you can't publish any of it because the person you're looking at will know who I am. And you make a note of that all the way through your notes, in capital letters, do not publish. And but you're completely right that the details can make a story. Like with the President's Club one, there were so many details from, the dress codes that the women had to wear to the, the balmy things that the auctioneer was saying on stage. So there was tons of colour, and we didn't have to worry about any of that. With this one, I do have to worry about it. And I guess some, there's safety in numbers, so where that, and say Harvey Weinstein, well, I guess it's legally contentious, I won't, say an anonymous businessman has, behaved inappropriately with 20, 30 women, well, they're not necessarily going to be able to identify one woman who claims that she was groped in a particular location, because he might have done that with 5, 10, 20 people. So you have to weigh up whether or not a detail will give someone away. And you do have to think about that carefully.
And that is exactly the issue that I'm dealing with at the moment, kind of your question, that balance between giving, you know, most of my sources in the story, the key women are anonymous. And we've got to give enough detail in the story to make it believable and verifiable, but not enough to give away who the women are. And it was the safety numbers that we're kind of using, in that we know there are many women who, where there's a similar pattern of behaviour that they've all spoken about. So what we do, particularly when you have an anonymous source who's more likely to come under scrutiny or be less believed, is then look at getting the numbers to verify what they've told you. So if we have one on the record source, then one anonymous source, I try and get, you know, two say others who would verify what they've told me. But I think ultimately, the priority for any journalist is source protection. So, you know, if it made the story less believable to your average reader, but it met the legal checks, the factual checks, then I would lose that, even if it made the story more exciting, whatever, because my number one priority would be to make sure my source, and often they're vulnerable people taking a great risk, is protected.
Also, and the detail doesn't need to be about the victims. It doesn't need to be about their experience. The detail, you know, when you're dealing with you know, nasty prominent businessmen or women or politicians or whoever, their lives are colourful. You know, you've got tons of detail from their day-to-day interactions with the world. So, yeah, no shortage of quite astonishing details sometimes, which doesn't compromise any of your sources.
Hello, hi. Obviously, both of you have had the good luck to work with some excellent editors. Jane obviously emphasised the amount that Heidi does. I was wondering, obviously, a huge factor in being able to do investigative journalism is having the time to work on things and just having that space. Beyond that, what are the best things editors can do to support investigative journalists? What is it that investigative journalists need in order to do good work?
They need to have your back. So, frankly, yeah, it's at the FT, it would be very difficult to get a very contentious article published if you didn't have an editor who was kind of supporting you through that process, and not just in terms of editing the copy, but talking to the lawyers and dealing with queries about sourcing. And Paul Murphy, who's the investigations editor at the FT, has done a huge amount of behind the scenes legwork. I really should have had a byline on everything I've written to do with him, but he won't take it. But he's brilliant. So, and without him, I don't think either stories would have ever run. So yeah, you definitely need someone who's going to support you kind of from start to finish with, you know, your stupid questions through to how to phrase questions for the other side's lawyers, to you know, how to construct it. They're critical.
Yeah, I'd agree completely with that. You need an editor who backs you, and also an editor who's got guts and isn't afraid of taking a risk for a story that's important enough. I think also practically, like for me, working with an editor who knows investigations has been invaluable, because when I go to them for reporting advice, I've got someone who knows investigations and they can give me advice, whether it's on standing up a story, getting a whistleblower to talk, or just kind of legally and editorially having your back. And I think, most journalists would say that they would go where a good editor is. And, that's what took me to Buzzfeed. It was only after they hired my editor that I was like, oh, they're serious about investigations, A, and B, I've got someone I can learn from.
What's your approach to pitching? At what stage do you pitch? How much research do you do before you pitch the idea?
You've got to know the story's got legs, so there's no point pitching something where you've got one source and you've not checked it out beyond that. So, yeah, with the President's Club, I had a page of information. It might not sound like a lot, but a kind of page-long summary of, who went, what the women said about it, what the organisation was. It was a charity, and who its trustees were, and all that kind of information. And a plan, ideally. And Yeah, you can't. Don't. Editors hate flimsy pictures. You've got to make sure it's got legs.
As someone who used to make a lot of flimsy pictures, like, oh, I want to put in this FOI, I want to speak to this person. I think that's one of the lessons I've learned more, having gained a bit more experience, is, you know, don't tell. It sounds obvious, but don't go to an editor until you've got the FOI back, until you know what the source is going to say, until you've got kind of basic prima facie that shows there is something there. Because otherwise, you know. And I think an editor would rather have someone who comes to them with one good pitch a month than someone who's constantly coming with rubbish or half-formed ideas, because then when you do come to them with a pitch, like, all right, this journalist is solid, they know what they're doing, they're not going to come to me with something that's half-baked, and you'll get more time and more likely to get commission, I think, if you pitch smartly like that.
Obviously, when you're working with anonymous sources, particularly in investigations, like the President's Club, and as you mentioned with Weinstein as well, they're going to be on quite sensitive topics. As a journalist, how do you ensure that your sources know that you're going to treat those topics sensitively, that you're going to accurately represent their stories, particularly if you're kind of initially starting out investigations and you don't necessarily have quite a strong track record behind you to kind of show your style of reporting or your way of representing pieces?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question, and I think the key thing, it sounds simple, but is to take the time to listen to them and take the time to meet with them in person rather than send an email or have a chat over the phone. I mean, that could be your initial point of contact, but I think showing that you care enough to take the time, sit down and have a long meeting with them, hear them out and listen to what their concerns are, what they've got to say, that really goes a long way. And for me, when I'm at the point where I'm preparing to publish something, I want to make sure they're kept in the loop. I want to make sure that they know kind of the parts of their story we're going to be reporting, to make sure it's accurate, and also so they feel like the investigation, the stories never got, run away from them. And I think those are steps that really kind of go a long way to gaining trust with sources.
I think so the more information you give, the better. So this can be problematic, because when you're approaching people, you've got no idea whether, I mean, it's happened. So with WPP, for instance, last year, that was a story about why Sir Martin Sorrell left WPP, and there was an investigation going on into his conduct. Nobody knew what the investigation actually related to, so I kind of went on a mission to figure that one out. And you slightly have to approach people blind. You're just going through LinkedIn looking for former employees, or former PAs, or former cooks, or former chefs and chauffeurs and whatnot. And you don't. I remember there was 1 week, I think, where I sent off, say, 20, 30 LinkedIn requests saying, "Would you have a chat?" I'm working on a piece to do with WPP and Sir Martin Sorrell. You don't want to give the game away. You don't want to know exactly what you're writing, although the investigation was in the news, so people knew there was an investigation, so you could put two and two together. But anyway, that week I sent off all the requests. I got a legal letter a call from, I think, WPP's PR team saying, we know that you've been approaching former employees, and I can't remember what, it's a common thing. It basically gets back to your source. And so, yeah, you have to be aware that not everyone you approach is going to be on your side, and that they might feed the information back to the company. By the same token, it puts people at ease the more information you give them. So you have this horrible balance of, do I tell them exactly what the investigation is, or do I just kind of give them a few hints and clues? And then, yeah, so that's just something that's quite hard to weigh up. I normally go for a halfway point. And then the other thing is, lots of people have never spoken to a journalist before, and journalists are intimidating, and they've got no idea what off-record, backgrounds, on-record, any of those terms mean. So for people who are, you really get the sense that they are A, scared, and B, don't have a lot of experience of journalism, because most people don't, I would explain what all of those things mean and say, this will be off record. That means it's in total confidence. Your name is not going to be shared with anyone else, and I'm not going to tell you the name of anyone else I've spoken to. And you just set that out, because it makes people feel slightly more reassured, I think.
Hi. So both of the big stories that you guys were just talking about, it sounds very much like the backing of your publication, the editors, etc., that whole team behind the scenes was so important. Do you have any advice for example, a young freelancer at the start of their career who's kind of scrabbling around, desperately trying to make a mark without that big backing, but who wants to kind of get into that investigative side of things? how do you kind of get that career off the ground without your editors and without backing the name brand of an FT or a Buzzfeed behind you?
That's a really tough question, because I was briefly freelance for 9 months and I never realised until I was how much harder it is to get an editor to reply to your bloody email if you're not in the same newsroom as them. And I think part of it, it is about building up relationships. So once you've successfully pitched to an editor once and you did a good job, they're obviously much more likely to hire you again or pay attention to your email again. So I think my key advice would be form a good idea and know how to pitch it, know the organisation you're pitching for, because nothing's more annoying than if someone pitches you something and you've already covered it or it's not the kind of thing they'd cover. So I think just showing you know the publication, you've thought through your pitch, and you're full of ideas. I think that's how you stand out as a freelancer. Like, you're expected to do so much more than kind of a staff journalist, and I think ideas are your currency, especially well-researched ideas.
You need a decent, look, newspapers love stories. So if you've got a great story idea and you've fleshed it out and you know it's got legs, then if you bring it to the right newspaper, hopefully they'll want to work with you. You need to find the right newspaper, the right editor, and the right journalist. And the thing I'm working on at the moment, which I've alluded to a couple of times, was actually brought to me by a freelancer. We don't often, ever work with freelancers, so this is quite unusual, but I had this much conviction in the story that I kind of lobbied to make sure we could do it. So it can, basically, even at places which don't normally work with freelancers, it can happen. So you've just got to have a really good idea. But I would say I've never been freelance, so it's tricky to advise. But I think almost anywhere you work, whether it's a trade publication or a newspaper or an online-only media outlet, there's scope to do meaningful investigations. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point that Madison made. Like, I've found that often pitching to a reporter I trust, a respected reporter I trust at a publication, gets me in the door and gets me the attention of an editor more than if I kind of just blindly email an editor. Because if you've got the reporter's buy-in, and hopefully the reporter is respected by the editor, then you're much more likely to get commission. And same for me, in that we normally don't work with freelancers, but I did one story a few months ago with a freelancer just because I thought the story was brilliant and we could do it easily, and we commissioned him even though we wouldn't normally, because he kind of had a reporter on side. So I think that can often be kind of a backdoor in, which is easier than blindly approaching editors.
The downside is you have to share a byline and you lose some control. But
yeah, make sure the report is a good one. No one that's going to steal the byline.
Yeah. But the upside is you get published, so.
Hi, so we had a lot of troubles of possible legal restraints and things like that. But have you ever thought about the possibility of getting a D-notice, for example? So have you ever experienced this, or know colleagues who got that? The D-notice?
I don't know what that is.
Is a notice that the government gives out sometimes if they want to kind of calm down the publicity of certain publications or journalist news or things like that. So if you get like a note from the government, for example, that they will tell you not to publish a certain story, have you ever experienced that before, or have you heard that?
I've not had that. We might get injuncted, but that's obviously very different because it's not the government. I think we've both been injuncted before, and that's kind of the realist risk of something like that happening. But I've never been denoticed before, no.
I've not even heard of it, so fortunately not. It sounds stressful.
Sounds brutal. Well, look, I just want to say an enormous thank you to both of you for sharing your time with us tonight. Especially, Madison, I know you've got to go move house tonight or something crazy like that.
Tonight, but I've got a mile to do that.
Yeah, but thank you both so much. It's really, really appreciated. And thank you also to my employer for letting us use the space, City for coming along and being part of this, and a big round of applause to our speakers. Thank you very much.